At 25,000 feet, cold isn't just a temperature. It is a violent, living thing. It creeps through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage. It turns sweat into needle-sharp ice against your skin. It freezes the grease in machine gun mounts and hardens human blood in seconds. Inside a German flak battery outside Saint-Nazaire, the gunners were laughing. They had every reason to be confident. Through their rangefinders, the incoming American bomber formation looked less like an armada and more like a line of slow, helpless cattle marching straight into a slaughterhouse. The Germans tracked the lead B-17 flying fortress. Adjust coordinates. Fire. A burst of flak shattered the sky. Black clouds of smoke exploded in front of the bomber's nose. Splinters of hot, jagged steel ripped through airframe, canvas, and flesh. The German spotter lowered his optics, expecting the familiar sight, a wing snapping, a spatter of fire, and tiny black dots tumbling into the abyss as the crew abandoned ship. Instead, they saw an engine detonate into a blazing fireball. Plumes of black, oily smoke trailed hundreds of feet behind the bomber. The aircraft banked wildly, slipping out of the safety of the box formation. In the German pit, the crews began to cheer. The target was dead. It was dropping out of the sky. Standard procedure dictated that any crew with an engine ablaze at this altitude had roughly 30 seconds to hit the silk, or roast alive inside a flying stove. They waited for the parachutes. 1, 2, 3, nothing, no white silk opened against the gray European sky. The bomber didn't spin out. It pulled out of its death dive. Battered, blazing, and trailing a comet of flame, the broken B-17 turned back toward the target. In the cockpit, surrounded by filling smoke and screaming alarms, one young man held the yoke. His uniform was already charring. His oxygen mask was melting against his face. His crew was screaming at him over the intercom to bail. He ignored them. He refused to jump. This is the untold story of the men who flew the flying coffin, and the one young pilot who looked guaranteed death in the face, pushed back his throttle, and defied every law of aviation history. To understand why a man would stay inside a burning furnace 5 miles above the earth, you have to understand the absolute meat grinder that was the early air war over Europe in 1943. The Allied High Command was obsessed with an idea: daylight precision bombing. The theory on paper was elegant, almost clinical. If you fly high enough during the day, you can see the factories, the ball-bearing plants, and the U-boat pens. You drop your bombs with surgical precision, and you destroy the enemy's ability to wage war without leveling entire civilian cities. It sounded brilliant in an air-conditioned briefing room in London. In the freezing skies over Germany, it was a horrific nightmare. The Allied bombers were flying without fighter escorts. The standard P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings simply didn't have the fuel capacity to follow the bombers all the way deep into enemy territory. Once the escort fighters hit their fuel limits over the coast of France, they had to turn around. The moment those fighters turned back, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs waited like wolves in the clouds. They knew the Allied bombers were alone. They fell upon the lumbering formations with 20 mm cannons and heavy machine guns. And then came the flak. Standard anti-aircraft artillery wasn't designed to score direct hits. It didn't need to. The Germans used timed fuses that filled the sky with thousands of steel fragments. If you were inside a B-17, the sound was unbearable. First came the thump, thump, thump of distant explosions. Then came the rattle, like rain hitting a tin roof, except every drop of rain was a shard of red-hot steel traveling at 2,000 feet per second, tearing through cables, hydraulic lines, and human bodies. The casualty rates were staggering. During this period, a bomber crew was required to complete 25 missions before they could go home. Statistically, the odds of surviving 25 missions in 1943 were less than 25%. Think about that. When a young man stepped onto the tarmac in England, he wasn't just risking his life. He was walking into a statistical certainty of being shot down, burned, or blown to pieces. Tension inside the barracks was suffused with terror. Men would leave for a morning mission, leaving their beds unmade, their cigarettes still sitting in ashtrays. By evening, half the beds in the barracks would be cleared out by support staff, their personal belongings packed away into cardboard boxes before the next batch of fresh-faced replacements arrived. The brass knew the strategy was bleeding them dry. The Bomber Command was facing a crisis of morale that threatened to halt the air campaign entirely. They didn't just need a better plane. They needed a miracle. And more than anything, they needed someone insane enough to prove that the sky could still be conquered. Enter Lieutenant Arthur R.T. Becker. He didn't look like a hero. He wasn't the tall, square-jawed poster boy the Army Air Forces liked to feature in propaganda reels. He was short, soft-spoken, and possessed a quiet, stubborn streak that routinely infuriated his superiors. Before the war, Artie was an auto mechanic from a dirt-poor town in Ohio. He understood machines. He knew how metal bent under stress. He understood how fuel lines breathed, how oil burned, and how engines died. To the high-ranking officers at division headquarters, RT was a thorn in their side. He wasn't interested in parade ground discipline or spotless uniforms. He cared about one thing: keeping his crew alive. When he arrived at his base in East Anglia, he immediately clashed with the commander, Colonel Iron Jaw Vance. Vance was a traditionalist. He believed in strict adherence to flight manuals, proper radio protocol, and unquestioning obedience to flight paths no matter how deadly those paths turned out to be. Artie looked at the flight manuals and saw a death warrant. The manuals were written by engineers in California who have never had someone shoot a cannon at them. Artie told his crew during their first briefing, "In this cockpit, we fly by what the metal tells us, not what some guy in a suit wrote on paper." When Artie suggested modifying the defensive armor on the B-17, stripping out unnecessary weight like heavy radios to install custom steel plates around the waist gunners, Colonel Vance threatened him with a court-martial. "You don't alter Army Air Force equipment, Lieutenant," Vance barked, leaning across his mahogany desk. "You fly the plane we give you, the way we tell you to fly it. If your plane catches fire, you follow procedure, order the crew to bail, and abandon the airframe." "With all due respect, sir," RT replied, staring straight ahead. "If I jump out over France, my crew ends up in a POW camp or dead. If I keep the plane in the air, we go home." Vance scoffed. "If the wing is on fire, Lieutenant, you don't go home. You burn. Don't be a fool." Artie was relegated to the worst missions, the high-risk runs, over heavily defended coastal targets, the ones flight commanders assigned to crews they considered expendable. His crew knew they were flying with a maverick. Some of them were terrified of his stubbornness. Others knew that his obsessed focus on the mechanics of their aircraft was the only reason they were still breathing. They named their aircraft the Uninvited. It was an old, battered B-17F model. Its fuselage bore the marks of a dozen patched-up bullet holes, and its left engine had a habit of coughing oil across the pilot's windscreen. No one expected the Uninvited or its rebellious pilot to make history. To understand what made the B-17 Flying Fortress both a masterpiece and a death trap, you have to look at how it was built. It was massive. A four-engine behemoth designed by Boeing, bristling with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns. From the outside, it looked like an impenetrable flying fortress of steel. Inside, it was a different story. The skin of the B-17 was made of aluminum sheet metal, less than 2 millimeters thick. You could literally take a screwdriver and punch a hole through it with your bare hands. Running through this thin metal tube were high-pressure hydraulic lines filled with flammable fluid, electrical wiring, oxygen tanks pressurized to extreme levels, and thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel stored inside the wings. It was, quite literally, a floating bomb. Standard procedure in 1943 was clear. If a fire started in the engine bay and crossed the firewall into the wing, you had seconds. The heat generated by burning aviation fuel at high speed can reach over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, aluminum doesn't just melt, it disintegrates. The wing structure weakens, twists under the immense aerodynamic pressure, and snaps off. Once the wing snaps, the aircraft enters a flat spin. The centrifugal force pins the crew against the walls, making it impossible to reach the escape hatches. Everyone dies. Because of this, military doctors and flight instructors hammered one rule into every pilot's head: If the wing catches fire, get out. Bail out. Save yourself. The plane is already dead. Artie didn't accept that rule. He spent nights in the freezing hangar with his crew chief, studying the B-17's fuel lines and fire extinguishing systems. He realized something that the manual writers had missed. If an engine caught fire, the standard procedure was to shut off the fuel valve, feather the propeller, and hit the fire extinguisher bottle. But the fire bottle only released a brief spurt of CO2. If the fire was fed by high-speed wind forcing air into the engine nacelle, the CO2 was washed away instantly, and the fire roared back to life. Artie devised a maneuver that sounded completely absurd to every instructor in the Air Force. Instead of cutting the engine and diving away to let the crew jump, he proposed doing the exact opposite. If an engine caught fire, he believed you shouldn't dive away. You had to force the plane into an extreme, violent sideslip, putting the burning engine upward into the airflow, dropping the opposite wing, and slamming the throttles of the remaining 3 engines to full power. In layman's terms, you use the plane's own high-speed wind drift like a massive fire extinguisher, using sheer velocity and crazy aerodynamic angles to blow out the flame, like a man blowing out a candle. When Artie explained his theory to the other pilots in the mess hall, they laughed in his face. "You can't slip a 30-ton bomber like it's a trainer biplane, Artie," one captain laughed, sipping his warm beer. "You'll tear the tail section right off the airframe. You'll kill your whole crew." "The airframe can take it," Artie said quietly. "It's the pilots who give up too early." October 17, 1943. The target, Schweinfurt. It would go down in history as Black Thursday. Over 290 B-17s took off from England heading deep into the German heartland to strike the critical ball-bearing factories. The moment they cleared the fighter escort boundary, the Luftwaffe struck with unprecedented fury. Hundreds of German fighters swarmed the formations. Rockets, heavy cannon fire, and twin-engine destroyers ripped through the American boxes. Sky over Germany became a graveyard of burning metal and falling parachutes. The uninvited was in the trailing element, the most vulnerable position in the formation, affectionately known by pilots as Coffin Corner. 10 miles from the target, a burst of 20 mm cannon shells slammed into the uninvited's number 2 engine. Clang, clang, clang. The noise was deafening, like iron beams being slammed together inside the cockpit. Instantly, the cockpit filled with thick white smoke. Oil sprayed across the left windows, scorching black as it hit the hot exhaust manifolds. Then came the flames. Bright yellow, screaming orange fire erupted from the engine bay. The wind caught the blaze, whipping it back over the top of the left wing. Inside the cabin, the temperature skyrocketed instantly. Over the intercom, the waist gunner was screaming, "WBR-2 is on fire. It's on the wing. Chief, it's burning the fuel lines." The co-pilot reached instinctively for the alarm switch, the signal for the 10-man crew to hit their emergency release hatches and jump into the frozen void over enemy territory. Artie reached over and slapped the co-pilot's hand away from the switch. "Don't touch it," Artie growled through his mask. "Artie, the wing is on fire," the co-pilot yelled, eyes wide with panic. "Look at it. The skin is bubbling. We have 30 seconds before the wing snaps." I said, "Don't touch it." Artie disengaged the autopilot. He didn't cut the fuel to the burning engine. He didn't feather the prop. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He grabbed the heavy control yoke with both hands, slammed his left foot down on the rudder pedal with all his strength, and shoved the throttles of the 3 remaining engines forward into war emergency power. The 30-ton bomber groaned in agony. The airframe twisted violently as Artie threw the uninvited into an extreme, terrifying sideslip. Inside the rear fuselage, the gunners were thrown off their feet, slammed against the metal ribs of the plane as the world tilted at a nauseating angle. The bomber was falling through the sky sideways at over 300 miles per hour. The strain on the metal was astronomical. Rivets began popping along the main wing spar with sounds like rifle shots. Pop, pop, pop. "Artie, you're tearing the wings off," the co-pilot screamed, bracing his hands against the instrument panel. Through the cockpit window, Artie stared directly at the roaring wall of fire on his left wing. The heat was so intense it cracked the plexiglass windshield. The rubber seal on his oxygen mask was burning his face. He didn't pull back. He pushed the rudder harder. He forced the roaring hurricane of icy, 300 mph air directly into the throat of the burning engine bay. For 10 agony-filled seconds, the fire fought back. It surged, reaching toward the main fuel tank. The crew fell into sheer psychological terror. To stay inside a machine that is actively burning around you defies every human survival instinct. Every nerve in your brain screams at you to jump, to surrender to gravity, to escape the furnace. 10 seconds, 12 seconds, 15 seconds then, the flame flickered. The sheer force of the airflow starved the fire of oxygen, stripping the heat away faster than the fuel could ignite. With a hollow whoosh, the fire went out. Smoke still poured from the blackened, melted shell of the engine, but the fire was dead. Artie leveled the wings. The bomber shuddered, groaned, and settled back into level flight. Inside the cabin, there was absolute, stunned silence. No one spoke over the intercom. The gunners, covered in sweat and oil, slowly picked themselves up off the aluminum floor. The uninvited was battered, missing half its engine cowling, running on 3 engines with a cracked windshield and popped rivets, but it was still flying. And Artie wasn't done. Instead of turning back for England, he realigned the nose of his broken bomber with the rest of the formation and continued on toward the target. The uninvited dropped its bombs over Schweinfurt that day. Against all odds, Artie managed to limp the broken 3-engine bomber back across the English Channel, landing on a foam-covered runway in East Anglia with 0 fuel left in the tanks. When the tires touched the tarmac, the ground crew rushed out to meet them. They stood in silence, staring at the left wing. The aluminum skin behind the No. 2 engine was scorched black, warped, and covered in thousands of stress cracks. But the wing was still there. Artie stepped down from the crew hatch, pulled off his leather helmet, and walked away without saying a word to the waiting reporters. His maneuver worked. He had proven that a determined pilot, through an intimate understanding of his aircraft's aerodynamics, could blow out a wing fire and save his crew from death or captivity. He immediately submitted a detailed report to division headquarters, outlining the side-slip procedure and urging that it be taught to every B-17 crew in the 8th Air Force. The response from high command was swift and soul-crushing. Colonel Ironjaw Vance read the report, filed it away in a drawer, and stamped it, rejected. The official military stance was clear. The Air Force doctrine was built on standardized, predictable maneuvers. They considered Artie's high-speed side-slip an unacceptable structural risk to government equipment. Lieutenant Becker got lucky, Vance wrote in his official evaluation. Encouraging pilots to perform unapproved aerodynamic maneuvers will result in structural failures and lost airframes. Standard bailout procedures remain mandatory. The arrogance of the bureaucracy won. Artie's report was buried. The pilots were never trained in the maneuver. 2 months later, the cost of that arrogance was paid in human blood. During a mission over Bremen, a B-17 named the Heavenly Body flown by one of Artie's closest friends, Captain James Miller, was hit by flak in the exact same manner. A fire erupted in the No. 2 engine bay. Miller, a disciplined officer who followed instructions to the letter, adhered strictly to the Air Force manual. He cut the fuel, feathered the prop, and ordered his crew to prepare for bailout while holding the plane in a standard gentle dive. The fire didn't go out. Fed by the steady flow of air into the level engine bay, the flames rapidly spread to the main wing spar. Within 20 seconds, the intense heat melted the structural aluminum. Under the eyes of the entire formation, the Heavenly Body's left wing folded upward like a dying bird's, snapped completely off at the root, and spun into the clouds below. The aircraft entered a violent flat spin. Not a single parachute emerged from the wreckage. 10 men, including Captain Miller, died instantly when the aircraft impacted the frozen German earth below. When news of the crash reached the base in England, Artie went to Colonel Vance's office. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He simply placed his flight wings on the colonel's desk, looked the old man in the eye, and said, 10 men died today. because you were too proud to learn how to fly. Artie Becker survived the war. He finished his 25 missions, refused a promotion to major, and quietly left the Army Air Forces the moment the war ended in 1945. He moved back to Ohio, opened a modest auto repair shop, and never spoke publicly about his service. He didn't attend squadron reunions. He didn't write memoirs. Decades later, after classified military logs were declassified, aviation historians finally uncovered the flight records of the uninvited. They realized that Artie's unauthorized maneuver had actually been quietly adopted by individual bomber pilots, late in the war word of mouth, spreading through mess halls and flight lines, despite the brass's official refusal to print it in manuals. Countless airmen owed their lives to the quiet Ohio mechanic who refused to accept that his plane was born to die. Artie passed away quietly in 2004, a humble man who lived out his days fixing engine blocks and tuning carburetors. History books remember the generals. They remember the strategists who sat in safe, heated rooms in London and Washington, drawing lines on maps and calculating acceptable loss percentages. But history was truly made miles above the earth, in those 30 terrifying seconds of laughter, fire, and ice. It was made by a young pilot in a melting mask, holding a burning, screaming bomber together through pure defiance. When the German gunners on the ground looked up through their rangefinders, waiting for the silk parachutes that never came, they weren't just watching a broken plane refuse to die. They were watching a man who looked into the fiery jaws of death, slammed his throttles forward, and refused to jump.